Landscape drawings come in different drawing sizes, but all of them have in common that they contain a big view. They may have buildings and other man-made structures in them, but generally nature is an important part. Here are 7 tips about how we can draw landscapes such as these freehand and capture the visual effect of the big view. And if you'd like any more detail on the drawing of any one of these drawings, each one of them has their own video on my channel. My first tip relates to the fact that landscapes are, by definition, large views, and therefore there's lots of elements in them. And often we have some that are very close and therefore are more observable. Part of the difficulty is that there are so many elements that we have to get looking comfortable and realistic and effective in the landscape. A great way to do this is to focus on improving our drawing skills with the individual elements that we find ourselves drawing over and over in the landscapes. And what these are does depend on what sort of landscapes you enjoy drawing. For me, there are almost always trees in my landscapes, and therefore a good way to improve my landscapes is to improve my tree drawing, because I can draw single trees or just a very small group of trees over and over and over and over again and consciously critique them and improve them much faster than I can draw landscapes over and over and over again and do the same process, because I can draw this in 10 minutes, whereas this might take me 1 or 2 hours to draw. And then when I do sit down to invest more time and effort in this, it's easier because of the skills I've learned. For me, understanding how perspective affects aerial views of streets and buildings is an important thing, and this is also something I can practice just doing a row of houses without doing a whole landscape. Or it may be that we like to do old rural areas, and elements such as this remnant corner of an old timber fence are often in the foreground as a focal point. Or it could be other elements that we often see in rural areas. Whatever I like to include in my landscapes, if I've upped my skills in drawing just those elements, when I come to draw the landscape, I have a far stronger starting point. My second tip is, before you start to draw, work out the depths of plane. Now, this just simply refers to the distance between the closest part of our object of our view and the furthest point. And what depth is there going back? What's the distance? But it also recognizes the fact that there is a series of distances going back, which are often reflected in how we view the scene and therefore how we draw the scene. Usually, I think of 3 or 4 depths of plane. I have a foreground, which is all the elements that are closest to us. I have a far distance, which is all the furthest elements. And then I have the midground, and the midground may have 1 or 2 separate depths. And I think of these separately because when things are further away, they look different. Here are 3 trees that are drawn. Which group gives a stronger sense of distance moving back? Well, it's this one. And I've done 3 things with this. I've made the lines darker, heavier when they're closer, and they get lighter as the objects move into further depths of plane. I've also drawn less detail as the tree moves into further depths of plane, because again, that reflects what happens in life. We see less detail. And finally, I use lighter values. Values is the art word for lights and darks. So my darks for the same tree under the same light become lighter. I create a lighter value for the things in the furthest depth of plane, and that reflects the visual effect we get in life. So if we look here, my foreground is this fence post and this fence in here and what's in front of it. I have 2 midgrounds. I have this shrubbery, this foliage that sits on the other side of the fence, so this area. And then I have my, if you like, second midground, which are these houses that sit a long way further back than this foliage. And then I have my far distance. But we can adjust this according to whatever depth distance we have. Foreground, midground, and then these houses, even though they're not very far back from this house, compared to our last scene, I've still created 3 depths of plane going back to here, and then a very light line for the horizon. It doesn't have to be a big natural vista either. This landscape is small scale in comparison, but closest objects, heavier, thicker lines that create a stronger, darker value and show more detail of the rocks as the rock steps move further away. A thinner line, lighter lines, and less of them close together, creating lighter effects as they move back. Helps give a sense of foreground, midground, and distance. If I'm drawing from a reference photo, I will often use a pen to actually enclose the different depths of plane that I'm looking at. The third tip is don't forget the foreground. In a landscape, our interest is often in the mid and far distance in terms of the impact of what we're seeing and what we want to capture. And quite frankly, the foreground is often filled with fairly uninteresting subjects, often just tufts of grass and bits of leaf litter or gravel. But if we can't draw those, or if we don't give the same care and thought and planning and technique to drawing those as we do to what we think of as the main part of the drawing, then we're always going to have this weakness right in the front. Clearly with this, I had a lot of planning with my marks, and if you watch the actual video of it, you'll hear me explain in more detail how I processed and strategized and the techniques I used to create this scene. But it would have been easy to have really focused on this, well, more interesting part to draw and just gone, oh, there's just grass and stuff on the ground, and just done some rough marks, instead of taking exactly the same care with these as I took with these central steps or this tree here. And depending on the scene, a lot of the effect of the scene comes from foreground. And again, if the elements closest to us are things that we have trouble with drawing to look as good as things that are further back, then we need to practice our foregrounds. And one important thing often also neglected with foregrounds is foreshortening. An important breakthrough for my thinking was to realize that on the ground we had the same foreshortening happening that we have on the side of a building. If we think of this as a building with windows equally spaced, we know the windows are going to get thinner and thinner and closer together as they move down this wall. It's exactly the same thing with everything that's on this ground, whether it's leaves or shadows or clumps of grass. As they move further away, visually they're going to compress and get narrower, and the gaps between them will decrease as well. Not every landscape has a long lead-in of ground, but many do. We have to pay the right attention to it. It's perhaps a very small scale landscape, but I think it does show the importance of working just as hard at the effect we create, the marks we put, where we put them, how we put them, in the less interesting foreground of grass to draw, and then the way we foreshorten the effect as it goes further away as the interesting elements that are more fun to draw. The fourth tip is partly when we're composing our scene and partly when we're drawing it, but that's to be aware of pathways. By pathways, I don't mean literal pathways. I mean elements of the view itself, but also how we draw it to lead anyone looking at our scene into our scene and through our scene. So sometimes we can position the actual elements, such as we can go from this darker tree here, bounce across here, and then we follow a line of trees and we get this lovely zigzag back and forth into the far distant hills, taking the viewer into the scene. Of course, having been careful with my foreground grass and this foreground shrub that peeks into the corner. But I can also use value in a way to strengthen what visually is happening and to pull back any visual elements, but which might fight against this rhythm of movement that value and various elements create to take us in. Sometimes it's a literal pathway, and when this is the case, we have to make sure that we don't oversimplify what can be a large part in terms of square inches of our scene, and that we draw the detail and take the time for what is often less interesting to draw. Although sometimes there's minimal line work, for the same effect. Here we have both this bridge and the shadow it's casting on the sand beneath to draw us into the scene, and then we can use the footprints to get to the figures here. Value itself is a powerful pathway. While again there is a pathway here, it's the fact that the light is coming down from the upper right corner and creating a strong contrast with each side of the path that this path really becomes compelling. We focus on this largest area of light value here, where we basically have the most paper with no marks on it, and then our eyes follow the light into the distance. Again, it's not a landscape of great depth, but I've still divided it up into foreground, midground, further back midground, and far distance, what we see poking through the trees at the very back. We have a number of pathways in this fairly complex scene, which I think works well because being complex, we want to engage the viewer more to explore all the things that have been included here. But we have this stairway up here, this pathway with steps up here, but we also have this dark value coming down here, where we have a creek winding through the forest floor. And then we also have this pathway back here of light that winds us in a different direction as well. And you'll see all the elements we've talked about so far here, working on individual elements such as natural rock formations, of depths of plane being plotted before I start then manipulating my marks and my lines to reinforce or create those depth of planes, and taking care with my foreground. With landscapes, we need to vary our marks. There are a lot of different things we want to represent, and if we want them all to stand out as separate things, if we want to be able to tell what's what, then we need to be able to draw things in a way that creates separation, distinction, even when perhaps they're the same object, such as the same tree, but moving back at different depths. Here I was playing around with finding different marks to express different types of trees, and not to be tempted to draw generic trees. It's not just the marks, it's how we combine them. Some are straight, some are curved. When we have a scene that's quite complex, we need to control our marks carefully to create the effect that will let us see the different things as different things, and not to get lost. We want our viewer always to be able to say, oh, well, this is a pathway here, and oh, these are some like small weedy plants growing very close, and here we have some ferns and things a bit further away, and here we have some trees in this midground area, and we know that this big tree here, this overhanging tree, is quite close compared to everything else, and I can tell that this roadway up here is really quite a lot further away than down here, and I can tell that these trees on the horizon line are much further away than anything else we're seeing here, not just because they're on the horizon line, but because the effect that has been achieved through controlling the marks, how heavy they are, how close together they are, the effect they create has been made. Line direction can be really important in creating effect. If we look at this Swiss mountain range up here, we can see that the rounded surfaces of the weathered rock has been echoed, reinforced, or visually created for the drawing by the direction of the lines, and also by varying the weight. We've got a sense of 3 dimensions of light hitting different parts in different ways. And we've drawn the snow by not drawing any marks at all. There is a sense that this lower right section of the mountains is quite a lot closer than this upper left section, because again we've controlled our marks to create the effect, the feel that this is closer rather than this. We've been able to create the effect of distance. When we have very tangled scenes, it's often helpful to create a halo effect when we're drawing with the marks that we make. To draw emphasis, notice the foreground here, just as much care as the more interesting midground, defining a foreground, a midground, and particularly where things overlap, it can be very effective to actually create a little bit of separation from our marks. I think of it as a halo effect, which lets the object which is in front is closer to us, just quite clearly be closer to us, and that pushes the other object further back. The 6th point is with landscapes, pay particular attention to what I think of as edges, because edges create silhouettes. Our brain often jumps to silhouettes to try and fast track understanding what it's looking at. So we want to work with that. Imagine the difference to how this scene would look if I'd drawn straight lines for these distant headlands, instead of a series of marks that stop and start and even have greater thickness in parts than other parts, all of which is aiming at reproducing the effect of the atmospheric conditions of the air quality, what we can see from this distance, and the direction of the sun, and the shadows it may be causing. On this closer headland, I've done something similar, but stronger marks when we look at the tree canopy that we're largely seeing in silhouette because of the lighting. I haven't drawn a fluffy or curvy line around the whole canopy. Instead, I've hatched up to it and I've made a few marks that don't really have a name to describe them, to indicate the leafy, uneven edging that we have. Some of these marks might even indicate actual leaves. I've minimized my line work with the water, just a couple of lines to suggest movement. But if I'd put a lot of line work, even in different directions, on the water surface, it would have reduced the clarity between this foreground and the distance, made it easier to read what was happening. Sometimes we don't use lines for edges at all. The trees on the far ridge I've represented with some hatching to represent their colour and their value, but I haven't drawn a line across the top at all. I've simply stopped my hatching approximately at the same place all the way along, and that's helped to create the somewhat uneven effect that we get. But on this closest object even, this tree trunk here, again, I've avoided coming straight down on each side with my pen and doing two fairly heavy lines. When I look at the tree in life, I'm not aware of the lines on each side. I'm not aware so much of where the tree ends as where the tree is. I'm aware of this part that comes towards me. I'm particularly aware of the curving away part that's attracting shadow, and I'm aware of the texture of the bark. A continuous line here, a continuous line there, will not create a realistic effect. We need to get away from thinking that I'm drawing lines to outline shapes of different objects, and instead thinking I'm using marks to create certain visual effects, which brings us to the seventh point. And that's that we need to think of hatching as not just a way of putting shade on the side of the building that's turned away from the sun or the shadow that it might cast on the ground, but as a way of actually creating forms that we see, because we don't have to outline. In this French forest scene, there really is no vertical line. There really is no continuous outline anywhere. The whole scene has been created by using marks and by hatching. And this is the seventh point, to use hatching to create forms rather than outlining. Everything from the tree trunks to the light coming through and the shadows, the shrubs, has been created not by outlining shapes, but by manipulating the lights and darks, the values, through hatching, to create the sort of effect we see. If we jump to a Swiss forest, we can see it works with a forest of fir trees just as happily. But we can come back to Australia, and where we go from foreground to mountain in the distance, and again using hatching to basically create all of the trees and the mountain ranges.
G'day, I'm Stephen Travers.
Landscapes are great subjects to draw, even freehand directly in pen. The principles that I use in drawing simple ones are exactly the same as the ones I use in more complex, larger scale drawings. So whether you're a beginner or you have quite a bit of experience in drawing landscapes, why not have a go employing any of these 7 tips? But in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.